Okay, firstly, let me say again, just thank you so much for inviting me to talk at this amazing centre, which does such important work globally, thinking about childhood art and reconceptualizing, I think, childhood art and all that it has to offer to us. It's a real privilege, a real honor to be here. I am aptly speaking to you all in the shadows of my kitchen, because here in London it's 8 p.m. and it's absolutely pitch black outside, but it's a real joy to be here, and you may well hear some pattering of feet either in the kitchen or upstairs as my children go off to bed. So apologies if they do make an appearance. Another apology that I begin with is a slight tweak to my title for the talk, which often happens when you actually start writing and producing and thinking, is that the title changes a little bit. So the new title is Light Play, Thinking with the Shadow in Observations of Childhood Art. So in this talk, what I want to do is explore the potentials of thinking with the Jungian concept of the shadow when observing childhood art. I want to stress right from the outset, I am not a psychoanalyst, and I'm not attempting to apply in any straight kind of way the idea of the shadow in the field of children's art. So what I'm instead doing is inviting into our theoretical framing of childhood art the idea of the shadow, and seeing what it might do, what it might contribute to the broader task of reimagining childhood art within a post-developmental paradigm. So let me start just by talking you briefly through where I'm going with this talk, where I plan to go over the next 40 to 45 minutes. So I'll start at a broader level, thinking about post-developmentalism and childhood art, why we so desperately need to be post-developmental, in my opinion, what it means, and the questions that it raises for us about how we actually move forward theoretically, methodologically, when observing childhood art through this post-developmental lens. I'll then talk a little bit at that point about some of the theoretical concepts that recently, I say recently, probably in the last 5 years or so, have found really helpful and enriching when thinking about childhood art, and particularly the concept of entanglement and the reconceptualization of childhood art as an entanglement, to draw on the language and the thinking of Karen Barad. But you will see as I'm talking that as much as I'm deeply influenced by the work of Karen Barad, I'm not a fully fledged member of the New Materialist Club, in that I'm often looking for opportunities to bring new concepts, well, humanist concepts, to bear on being with children's art as well. I seem not to be able to turn away from humanism quite to the extent that I would like to be a member of the New Materialist Club. And so this is where I've come into contact with thinking about the shadow and the idea of these unconscious urges that when constructive, when integrated into the psyche, have a really creative force, but when unintegrated into our whole being, spill over the edges into our behavior in often uncomfortable ways, sometimes destructive ways, sometimes ways in which we're really not aware of it doing so. So I'm going to engage with Jung's writing on the shadow, particularly writing he produced at the very end of his life. But again, just to stress, this is a dialogic and a playful engagement rather than a more wholesale application. If I had longer to talk, I would go into more depth about the things I really love about the Jungian shadow, but also some of the big question marks I have about some of the things that Jung wrote at the end of his life in 1958. I don't have quite enough time to do that. So instead, what I'll do is think and talk about why we could bring the shadow into our explorations of childhood art, and what might happen if we start to do that, but also try and engage with the idea that it works both ways, that we're thinking with the shadow in relation to childhood art, to reconceptualize childhood art, but that we can also think with childhood art in order to reconceptualize the shadow and reinvigorate the shadow, and make it something that's useful to us. Towards the end of the talk, I'll bring some of this theorizing to bear on an actual observation of childhood art from this very kitchen in which I sit. So a domestic, informal observation of my children and my sister's children making art together one Sunday afternoon. And I'll reflect on what thinking with the shadow prompts us to think and ask about this observation, particularly what it guides us towards that we might otherwise neglect or even avoid. The ideas that I offer up in relation to this observation are fledgling. They're very little birds that are flying from the nest for the first time. And they have a long way to go. They have a lot of growth to go through in order to become the full and the rich ideas that I think they might be. But I wanted to share with you these fledgling ideas and hopefully have a dialogue with you about these ideas and where they might go. So let's start then with post-developmentalism. Post-developmentalism and childhood art, what's the point of it? So the project of post-developmentalism in the context of children's art making is about moving beyond looking for developmental milestones in children's art making, with the intention to instead engage with the messy riches of children's action, experience, meaning making, play, their learning as it unfolds here and now in moments of their art making. So most fundamentally, post-developmentalism is challenging the dominance of developmental psychology as a lens through which to look at children and childhood experiences, including childhood art. Why? Because the dominant developmental lens is problematic. For two reasons, I think. The first is that the paradigm is built around normative trajectories that children are expected to fit into. And what happens predictably is that children already experiencing and encountering disadvantage due to structural inequalities in society are those who are least likely to fit the norms. They're the ones who are least likely to get ticked off on those developmental milestones. And as a result, they're the ones most likely to be marginalized, to be cast as abnormal in some way, to be cast as waiting to be fixed. Now, maybe that sounds kind of a bit extreme to you, but I think I often see this in mainstream early childhood art pedagogies, not just mainstream early childhood pedagogies, but mainstream early childhood art pedagogies. So for example, recently I was surprised to see on social media people calling themselves early childhood art teachers, selling this idea of the pen disco. Not sure if anybody else has seen this. And please do tell me if I'm misunderstanding it, and maybe there's an advocate of the pen disco here who can correct me if I've misunderstood this. But when I looked into it, essentially it seems to be that children around the age of 4 are given a pattern, a visual pattern, and asked to repeat it, to make it over and over and over again with a pen while listening to music. And this is branded and sold as a pen disco, as an art making activity. It's essentially doing lines with some music on in the background for what I can see. And it's obviously not about art making. It's about the development of fine motor skills in order for the children to get to a place of writing readiness, a place where the teachers can begin to introduce letter formation and not just patterns as they see them. So this isn't art to me. This is a pretense of art held hostage by top-down literacy and school readiness agendas, all underpinned by the foundations of developmentalism. In my mind, we need an approach to childhood art that enables us to be with, to enjoy, to engage with the full richness of what children are actually doing when they make art. Anyone who's around children when they might make art, who gets to sit beside them or talk to them while they're making, surely comes away from the experience, from the phenomenon, thinking, wow, there's a lot going on here. This is an exciting site of action and experience. And we need tools and approaches that actually help us to get under the skin of that, to understand that, to find a way in, basically. And developmentalism, to my mind, doesn't really help us with that. So for me, this links with an experience I had as a PhD student many moons ago. So my PhD research straddled departments. It was in the education and the psychology department at Oxford Brookes University. So to begin with, I was very much bringing a developmental psychology lens to my observations of children's art. I didn't even call it childhood art. I thought about it as children's picture making. And that still remains in the title of my PhD today. And I go so far as to say that I didn't really realize that there was much beyond developmental psychology that I could apply, that I could think with in relation to children's visual meaning making. I had this research design in my PhD that involved comparing children's art on paper with children's art on the computer. It's going to be very neat. It was a pseudo-experimental setup with lots of great, precise plans for data collection in preschools and schools. I was going to collect up all of these artifacts, whether they were on paper or on the computer, do a content analysis and apply some of the measures in developmental psychology that relate to children's drawings. I went out to schools and I started my data collection, and you can probably guess where this is going. It didn't work. The neatness didn't work. It couldn't come good. My very first participant was a 3-year-old boy who, when I asked him to draw me a picture on paper, he was sat down beside me. Suddenly, he was caught up in this hugely dramatic story about a storm, which he started to bring to life in his art making. He was bouncing up and down in his chair. He was shouting about the rain coming down and the lightning striking, and there's thunder, and he was making these dashes across his paper really furiously. And then he was out of his chair and running around, and I was really worried I was going to get into trouble because he wasn't just sitting there nicely beside me. But I was gobsmacked with the amazingness of this imagined storm and the role that the art making played in this imagined storm. Of course, I collected the drawing and it looked like a series of dashes on a piece of paper that kind of been ripped and smudged all over. I didn't have the tools and the approaches to bring at that point to understanding what had just happened, but I knew it was captivating, and I knew that there was something there that actually was far more interesting to me than the neat plans for data collection that I'd originally had. So I'm happy to say that at that point, I started to move away from developmentalism as the theoretical framework for exploring childhood art and start to take steps towards post-developmentalism. So let me be clear that post-developmentalism is not just about rejecting developmental psychology as the dominant paradigm, but about the conviction that there is so much more here for us to look at, that there is so much more here that's interesting. And we cannot get to it if we limit ourselves by seeing the child only as a becoming adult, rather than meeting them where they are in the moment when the art making is happening. But post-developmentalism moves us away from that and moves us towards this richness, but it doesn't give us a clear-cut set of tools to do that opening out work with. We still have a way to go. When we embrace post-developmentalism, we still need to be thinking about then which concepts we are going to bring to bear, which concepts are we going to invite in. And here, I've not been religious about adopting any particular concepts. I've been remarkably agnostic, I think, in that sense. For example, a lot of my work, very much inspired by That Boy and His Storm, has grown up within social semiotics and multimodal analysis. So trying to see the whole body in this art-making experience, and art-making as an embodied phenomenon of communication and interaction and experience. More recently, I've found concepts from new materialism fascinating to work with. And I'm sure quite a few of us here have probably found Karen Barrad's concept of entanglement particularly helpful. So for Barrad, an entanglement is a complex and lively manifold of entangled and changing practices and possibilities. It's the way in which everything is connected and enfolded and enmeshed with one another, where elements that are seemingly separate actually mutually constitute one another. So because of that, because elements that might look separate are actually making one another through their connectedness, we say that they're not interacting, they're interacting. So that is through their relationship to one another, they bring each other into existence. Thinking about childhood art as an entanglement challenges us to see things differently. So firstly, it pushes our gaze beyond what we think is just the child or just the art, and it helps us to see some of the connectedness and the mutual constitution that is going on within any moment of art making. So the entanglement and the interaction. This might be the materials, the discourses, and rather than seeing these materials and these discourses as surrounding the child's art making, as we might do from a socio-cultural perspective, the new materialist approach says the center and the context are not distinct. They cannot be distinguished from one another. So the idea that there is the child's art making and then things that sit around it doesn't really work if we're using entanglement. Instead, everything is this kind of dynamic, ever-changing, constantly fluctuating web of connections. What we end up with when we take up these ideas of entanglement and interaction is a methodological process of not knowing. And I'm borrowing that term from Professor Jane Osgood, who in turn borrows the idea of the not from Donna Haraway. So we are opening ourselves up to not knowing, but to accepting that there is this kind of not that we might never really disentangle. We may start with what we think is the thing, but we're quickly spiraling outwards and spiraling inwards to discover the material discursive entanglement that we're actually attempting to observe. So I've suggested elsewhere that what can happen then is that we start with moments of early childhood art that enable us to travel through wormholes to endless possibility. On the ground, when you're doing research in the form of observations of childhood art, and you're seeing it as this entanglement, this can feel like the endless relevance of everything. Everything is part of that childhood art. What you observe, what you can't observe. Barrad talks about this as an entangled genealogy, so a web of connections that are constantly moving and changing and shifting. You can attempt to engage with this web. You can definitely attempt to pay homage to this web. You'll never be able to represent it accurately because it is constantly changing. Though you might find it helpful to try and represent that web. So when you do research like this, you end up in funny places, and you have to be kind of tolerant of those funny places. So where the traditional parameters of the observation might not they might not work anymore. So both in terms of time and space, those parameters just may not work. You may need to go further, reach further to the before and the after, and the around. So what you thought was the center of the observation may well not be the center of the observation. What you thought was the frame of the observation may not be the frame of the observation. And as a result of doing research in this manner through this lens, there are insights into childhood art. I think there are really worthwhile insights to be had, but there are insights into much more besides. So my observations of childhood art in the home are really observations of an entanglement that involves childhood art, care, responsiveness, love, hate, worry, and I could go on and on and on. We talk about the logic of and rather than the logic of or. So at this point in the talk, I need to bring in the shadow because that's the key here. So in some ways, we might not think that concepts from psychoanalysis are going to have a very happy home within post-developmentalism. So psychoanalysts are in some ways quite dogged in their attachment to universal understandings of human development, human processes, and quite attached to attachment as a concept. And that's potentially a bit problematic. I recognize that. I recognize that it might not feel like such a comfortable fit, but I still see some of the concepts in psychoanalysis as really fertile theoretical starting points for thinking and talking about childhood art. Not least because some of the most open, exploratory, and expressive writing about childhood art comes from art therapy and art therapists writing about childhood art. There is, at the very least, among therapists, a strong and lively commitment to the riches of childhood art. And that seems like a good starting point. So to begin with, let's just take a layperson understanding of the shadow without bringing Jung too squarely into the room. So I listen to lots of kind of personal development podcasts, and I'm always tripping over the shadow. Everybody's talking about the shadow without any real mention of Jung, and that's fine. So it's a term I think many of us hear and perhaps use in everyday context, and I think that's a great place for us to begin. So we typically think about the shadow as these unconscious urges that are part of all of us, that if we don't tend to them, can spill out into our behaviors and our relationships and our lives in unintended ways. So this feels relevant to me, to childhood art, because there's a lot in observing childhood art that I found makes us uncomfortable, whether that's discomfort for the child or the adult watching the child in the moment, or the adult re-watching the observation and watching their interaction with the child. I think we encounter, or certainly speaking for myself, I encounter many moments that I find perturbing. And I don't necessarily know why, but I find moments of discomfort as well as loads of moments of joy and wonder and curiosity. So at a basic level, I thought, well, is the shadow a way to productively work with all that uncomfortable and unsettling stuff that seems to be happening in observations of childhood art? Could we think with the shadow to get at some of that discomfort, to move us to some of the messier, in a psychological or emotional sense, messier stuff that's going on with childhood art? But then I think if we start to layer on top of that kind of layperson approach and understanding that I was bringing, more of the original writings of Jung, it gets really fascinating, particularly when we bring in those that he produced at the end of his life. The theoretical landscape, the conceptual landscape becomes really rich in itself. So for the sake of this talk, and I mentioned that I have lots I could pick Jung up on, not least his belief, just to mention one tiny thing, his belief, as he wrote in 1958, that it would never be a pandemic that was going to throw the world into disarray. It was going to be a man-made disaster. and here we are, and COVID has happened. So he wasn't quite right on that, but fair enough. He was writing in 1958. But having mentioned that, there are 2 points about Jung's shadow, the Jungian shadow, that I think are really valuable for us. And those are the ones that I'm going to bring to you. So they are the ideas that the shadow is not just individual, it's collective. And the idea that the shadow is this active player. It acts and it affects, and I like to use the phrase, it comes out to play. So let me just take each of those points in turn. So firstly, the shadow is both individual and collective. So when we talk about the shadow in popular culture today, we tend to emphasize the individuality. So the idea that we all have a shadow self, with these unconscious yearnings that will act out unless we tend to them. But Jung was really clear that there is a unity between the shadow of the individual and the shadow of the collective human species. So he says of man, I'm afraid it is man, in the undiscovered self, that his individual situation is the same in principle as the collective situation. He is a social microcosm, reflecting on the smallest scale, the quantities of society at large, or conversely, as the smallest social unit, cumulatively producing the collective dissociation. So what makes up the shadow and how the shadow manifests, whether the shadow integrates into our whole selves or whether we fail to do this, these are all questions that resonate at both the individual and the collective level. I find that exciting in relation to childhood art because it feels like an invitation to explore not just what might be going on for particular people caught up in the observation in very clear ways, but instead for us to explore a more pervasive sense of shadow that might weave itself through an observation, might be part of that entanglement. That might be climate crisis, it might be the pandemic, it might be racism, colonialism, sexual violence, and so on and so on and so on. Any kind of collective burden that we bear as a society may be part of that entanglement, and that feels relevant and helpful. There's the individual, there's the collective, and there's unity between the two. The second point that comes out strongly and vibrantly from Jung's own writing is this capacity for the shadow to act and affect. I love these words that he uses to describe the shadow when it is untended to. So when we do not integrate the shadow, it is anarchic, it is turbulent. And even though he's talking here about quite destructive forces, they remind me that destruction and creativity are perhaps not opposites after all. There is a feeling of the creative for me in those words of anarchy and turbulence. And again, that just feels like an exciting starting point. Jung's portrayal of the shadow is much more dynamic than I'd given it credit for. I'd kind of thought about it as the shadow lurking in the corner of an observation. And actually, that doesn't work. If we take up the Jungian shadow, it's much more like the shadow comes out to play. And it comes out to play whether or not it's integrated or not integrated. It's there and it's playing. And so it moved my questions from how is the shadow present in the observation to, I think, a much more vital, alive question, which is how does the shadow come out to play? So What does it look like to draw thinking with the Jungian shadow into the entanglement of childhood art? I want to spend the rest of the talk trying to explore in this context, in the context of an observation of childhood art that took place in this kitchen with 3 of my own children, L aged 5.5, I aged 4, and R aged 18 months, and my sister and her 2 children, S aged 8 and E aged 4. The observation took place on a Sunday afternoon at the tail end of summer. And I'm lucky enough that I live 2 doors down from my sister, and we're in and out of each other's houses all of the time, as are our children. We socialize and often make art together. We'll do kind of clay workshops together typically, or painting. So for this observation, I set up some free flow art making with a selection of acrylic paint in highly squeezable tubes, some cloth, some rolls of brown paper, some large sponges, a palette knife, and some paintbrushes. The materials were laid out on the kitchen table on top of a tablecloth that you can see in the picture. We use it regularly for art making. I placed the camera on a tripod on a separate work surface, but also recorded on my phone as well. Took some photographs and made some shorter videos. Watching back all of the video footage, both from the tripod and the handheld camera, I started by writing what I could see and hear, and building on those written accounts, I started to work with these questions that you see in front of you. I've developed these in previous research when looking at children's photography, but also looking at kind of observations of children's art making with chalk, for example. And they really helped me to kind of identify moments of the observation, parts of the video that I want to attend to more closely. They're quite useful as a kind of zooming in tool, and they take you to alternative centers. So this is quite a useful starting point for not ending up with the center that you necessarily thought was the center when you went into the observation. So the first 4, what do I see? What do I notice? What do I feel? What's my physical response? What feels familiar? What do I recognize? What's surprising or unsettling? What strikes me as unusual? And then the final 2 are specific to this thinking with the shadow. And here, how does the individual shadow come out to play? How does the collective shadow come out to play? For the sake of time, I won't go into lots of detail about the kind of process of the analysis, but just to say it works through kind of iterative viewing and reviewing, reading and rereading the written accounts I've made, using quite a lot of stream of consciousness writing in order to see what emerges in response to the questions. And stemming from this process, I have my 3 fledgling idea birds to share with you, to shoo out of the nest and put that out into the world. And these ideas are fledgling, which means they are not exhaustive or generalizable in any way, shape, or form. They're possibilities in thinking that we stop by as we travel through the wormholes of observation. So the first fledgling idea to share with you when thinking with the shadow about childhood art is the capacity of childhood art to sit on the brink. Sit on the brink between the shadow self and the conscious self. More than this, art making is this time and space that offers itself for being on the brink. So we can see the materials that I laid out on the table as an invitation to the turbulent urges of the shadow self. And particularly, and my attention got drawn back and back again to these paint tubes, as did the children's attention. The squeezability of the paint tubes is an invitation to being on the brink, to allowing the shadow self to slip out or to be integrated. So of course we see the children at multiple points in the observation squeezing out far more than's needed to simply cover the surface they're working on. But we see other types of potential mess and potential physical disruption and actual physical disruption at every turn. And as I watch myself back in the observation, the kind of dominant feeling that I have watching myself is, wow, you're really waiting for things to mess up, for things to get messy. So there's a moment where R tips over the basket of really small fiddly bits and pieces all over the floor, or when L, hands covered in acrylic red paint, suddenly decides to stand up on her chair, and her hands go all over the chair and the acrylic paint goes all over the chair along with her hands. So Jung constructs the boundary between the shadow and the conscious self as an important place. Too often, he suggests, there's this barbed wire, that's another one of his terms, a barbed wire along this boundary, with little invitation for flow back and forth between the conscious, the shadow, the conscious, the shadow. But here we see childhood art situating itself in the boundary, in the liminal space. And its contribution, therefore, is not necessarily the mess, the anarchy, the turbulence, but the potential for mess, the potential for anarchy, the potential for turbulence. And rather than seeing these kind of destructive urges as good or bad, they become this inevitable part of the entanglement of childhood art. The second element that my mind comes to when I see the observation with the shadow in mind is one I would love to develop further. It's basically the idea that childhood art can be reconceptualized as a site of repression, or rather that childhood art is a site in which repression manifests. So we're used to thinking about, practitioners are often used to thinking about childhood art as a site of self-expression. That terminology, that thinking has been very wisely and acutely deconstructed by many, not least by Marissa McClure, whose writing is a tremendous influence to me. And rethinking kind of, is it self-expression or is it more like self-construction? But this idea of space where, a space where we can act and become more of ourselves, and it sounds really generative and wonderful. But when I engage in this iterative viewing of the observation with the shadow in mind, so often what I'm noticing is that the shadow does not come out to play. What comes out to play is the shadow of the shadow. It's watching the urges flicker and then die, flicker and then die. We seem to be watching the shadow of the shadow. So for example, I watch E, who's on the screen now, covering and uncovering his painted sponge with the cloth. So he squeezes out the blue paint onto the large sponge, looks around furtively, then covers it over with a white cloth. He looks around again, lays his hands on his lap, talks to his cousin, and then returns to the white cloth, taking it off, looking at the paint, then replacing it again. It's possible that this is an experiment of some kind. Is he expecting the paint to change, maybe, perhaps dry? But something about the way he looks around a social space and often frets over the paint on his hands while covering and uncovering the sponge, wiping at himself uncomfortably, suggests to me that he is in the space of working out what he can, but also what he cannot do, working out which urges can be acted upon and which must be covered over. The third and final element that I want to draw out from the observation follows on from this. It is the shadow of care in relation to childhood art, as it happens in contexts of care, in this case in the home environment with parents. As I watch and rewatch the video observations, I notice how my face and my sister's face do amazing things that I had no idea were happening at the time. I notice the way our nostrils flare and our lips purse, particularly when we look upon mess, or even when we look upon the potential for mess. There are moments of repressed revulsion, worry, and anger. These are all part of the entanglement, and one perhaps helpful way to think about them is as the shadow of care. So I've written previously about childhood art observations in context of care and responsiveness, inspired a lot by the amazing work of Laura Traffy-Pratts. But thinking with the shadow seems to push this entanglement of care to a stickier, ickier place where perhaps it needs to go. It isn't just that there is a context of care surrounding the childhood art that's neutral and eternally responsive, infinitely responsive even. I cannot turn away as I watch these videos with the shadow in mind. I cannot turn away from the fact that I am watching an observation of stress and tiredness as much as I am observing the wonders and the riches of childhood art. And this is a collective shadow, not just an individual shadow. I'm watching the stress, the tiredness of care that exists well beyond myself and my sister, and is of course exacerbated in situations less privileged than ours. What does this mean for observations of childhood art? I'm not suggesting that we shift our attention fully to the emotional labor of being with children as they explore being on the brink between the shadow self and the conscious self. But I am stressing the need to bring this care, the shadow of the care, the politics of the care, and the politics of the shadow of the care into the entanglement of childhood art. Too often, I think in art pedagogies, we talk about mess in childhood art as an integral part of the experience. And I don't disagree with that. But we need to also think about who is clearing up the mess, perhaps. Similarly, we can put on a pedestal adult responsiveness in childhood art, but this is entangled with the shadow of that responsiveness, the costs of the responsiveness to the adults who carry it out. I'll move now to my conclusion, and then I hope we'll have some time for questions and dialogue, but no doubt not as much as I would love to have with you. In this presentation, I've explored how the shadow can come out to play in childhood art, conceptualized from a post-developmental perspective as an entanglement. I've had a go at doing this with an observation carried out in my home of art making with 5 children, myself and my sister. I've suggested 3 insights that emerge when the observations are made with the shadow in mind, and watched and re-watched with the question, how does the shadow come out to play? I hope the insights, while fledgling, feel relevant on different levels. So firstly, they prompt us to problematize and rethink some of our standard thinking or mainstream thinking about childhood art, primarily that it's this happy site of self-construction. Working with the shadow flips our thinking so that we think as much about childhood art as a site of repression as expression or construction, as much about concealment as about revelation. And that's not to be gloomy. I love childhood art, but I think seeing those potentials for concealment, for repression, were a really fascinating thing to bring into the equation. Secondly, working with the shadow prompts us to see the on-the-brinkness of childhood art and the extent to which this is entangled with the materials that are part of art making. We can ask ourselves, is it pedagogically useful to be on the brink? And I think it probably is. And if it is, how we create environments that enable play and art making to happen in this liminal space. Thirdly, we're challenged to think about the physical and emotional labor that comes with this on-the-brinkness, that arguably can only happen in a context of care, where care is happening at the expense of others. Care is not a politically neutral phenomenon. We live with the shadow of care when we look at observations of childhood art, which happen in caring places, whether that's the home or whether that's an educational environment, a formal educational environment. In the home, women do the lion's share of the care. The same is true in early childhood centres. And we need to invite that in. So in early childhood art, we've invited in mess, but mess takes a toll, and mess has to be cleared up, and waste has to be absorbed. So there's a shadow of care there that's not just human, but perhaps also planetary. We can kind of go out and out with this. How do we bring that more fully, that shadow of care more fully into our observations and into our research? So I offer these lines of inquiry as just that, lines of flight, lines of curiosity that are part of the wider post-developmental project of reconceptualizing childhood art. I've really enjoyed sharing these thoughts with you, and I'm very much looking forward to questions and some dialogue. Chris, you're on mute.
Thank you. I was just saying thank you, Dr. Sakr. We really appreciated your presentation and the opportunity to think with your work today. We do have some time for questions. So for those who are in attendance this afternoon or evening, depending on where you are in the world, please go ahead and drop your questions into the chat or the Q&A, and we will do our best to address them. While we're waiting for some of the questions to maybe drop in the chat, one of the things that really struck me, Mona, just at the end when you were talking about not to be gloomy, but to really maybe take a moment to emphasize some of the repressive, difficult relations that are part of childhood art. And I wonder if you might just take a moment to kind of elaborate on that kind of rationale or that nudge to move ourselves to engage childhood art in that way.
Yeah, I think when I was starting to think about childhood art from a more post-developmental perspective, I ended up in lots of amazing sociocultural literature that talked a lot about the ways in which adults repress things within childhood art. And that, I think, is really apt, and still with my students today, we look at children's art that's kind of disturbing to adults and ask the question, if you were a teacher and a child in your class drew this, what would you do? And often the tendency is one of repression. So I think that's really important. But I think the thinking with the shadow, the thing that it offers us is kind of to understand and start to get at the complexity of that repression. So rather than seeing it as just kind of the child is free and creative and aren't they amazing and they're beautiful and they're trying to do so many interesting things, and along comes this adult who just squashes stuff. I think actually we need to give more room to the wholeness of children and realize that there is a hell of a lot going on for them in terms of both kind of expression and construction and repression, whether or not an adult is stepping in to say, don't use that much paint. They're kind of sometimes on the brink between using all the paint that they want to use and really questioning themselves about whether or not that's the right thing to do, whether it makes them feel comfortable. You know, and mess is such a complicated thing for so many children. And again, we have this kind of wider view that somehow it's the adult stopping the children from getting messy. But just as often, it's the child saying they don't want to get messy. And I think we need to kind of work with that and stay with that and be interested in and curious about it.
Thank you. Again, we have just a few moments left in the talk. If not, I can ask another follow-up question related to that idea of the mess. I think we may have one. Okay, so 2 questions. First question, and actually let me see, more of a comment rather than a question, but I appreciated this idea of care of some that pushes toward a lack of care of others. It makes me consider the ways in which some kinds of children who make certain kinds of art are often the focus of researchers. Another comment here or question, beautiful idea, birds. Mona, thank you so much. I'm wondering what the reception has been to your reconceptualizing work in the children's art community. Since you are speaking with us tonight, I'm assuming there is positivity, but I'm curious if there has been a reaction from those who see children's art at the ultimate moment of innocence and beauty. P.S. I wonder if you might enjoy Val Plumlin's writing on shadow places. Jung Free, though.
Thank you for that recommendation. I'm sure I will, and I'll definitely follow up on that. Yeah, it's interesting about the receptiveness. I think, yeah, generally there has been positivity about the idea of getting to spend longer or more intensive time with children's art making. And I think in a nutshell, post-developmentalism says, hey, why don't you just spend some time with children while they're making art? And that actually goes down really well with pretty much everybody who just wants to spend some more time being with children. I think you're right, though, that when you bring in some of the, I don't think it is gloom, but you say, well, hang on a second, some of this richness is a bit uncomfortable or unsettling, then there is more questioning around that. But often, I don't meet many practitioners who genuinely believe that children are in any kind of moments of innocence and beauty. I tend to meet more people that don't spend a lot of time with children who have that kind of view of children. But people that are with children a lot of the time generally are quite open to the idea that there are riches, but that the riches are messy. So yeah.
And I think we have time for one more. You had a question in the chat from Marissa Sweeney, who I believe you referred to in your talk today. Says, thank you so very much, Mona. I really appreciate your ideas about inviting caregivers into these spaces. How do you see that kind of disclosure in relationship to more traditional research practices in which the role of the researcher has remained in the shadows? So I'm really uncomfortable about it, basically. I think it's really important, and I think it's also really uncomfortable. I would have been not really telling the truth if I said that a lot of the time when I was watching and re-watching the videos, if I had made out that I only focused on the children, because I couldn't help but see myself in the situation and my sister in the situation. And so I felt I had to invite in the caregiver to the entanglement because they were so clearly a part of that entanglement. But it is horribly uncomfortable to do it because you're honing in on the costs of care in your own embodied form. And so I see it as crucial and important if we're going to move forward with this childhood art as entanglement thinking. And I see it as brave and kind of the people that want to call it into question and say, almost isn't it too easy to do this research in these personal contexts of care? I think it's definitely not easy. It feels the opposite of easy to actually write yourself back in a very full way. And I'm not just talking here researcher reflexivity along the lines of, this is my ethnicity, this is the ethnicity of my participants, this is my gender, this is the gender of my participants. But in fact, to say, I'm the caregiver in this situation and I was exhausted
when this was happening, or I was the caregiver in the situation, and I worried so much about the waste we were producing, because I think there are insights in that, and important insights in that. I'm not sure, I'm not there yet. I'm not saying I've had those insights, but I really feel that this is a line we need to go down much more.
Thank you, Mona. We've reached the end of our time today. I just wanted to say again, thank you for joining us this afternoon. And it was a wonderful talk. And for those of you who were able to join us this afternoon as well, I just want to thank you for taking time out of your schedules to be with us today. And a reminder that a recording of this presentation will be made available likely by the end of the week on our website. And then we will be doing a follow-up interview with Mona for the Childhood Art podcast, which will be available within the next month. So check back soon. And in January, we will also have Dr. Gail Bolt of Penn State University, who will be joining us for the Childhood Art Speaker Series. So again, thank you for being with us. We appreciate it.